Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Lily Rizzo-Dubois. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a health equity specialist here at MHS Health Wisconsin. Before we go any further, I'd like to let you know that this event is being recorded for future learning and reflection. Thank you all so much for being here today. I am so excited to introduce today's learning topic. Through storytelling, cultural context, and history, this virtual event highlights the journey of Hmong communities, their history, and how they began building new roots in Wisconsin during the 1970s that continue today. In partnership with Andrew Trumbull at the Burmese Rohingya Community of Wisconsin, BRCW, and Dr. Mai See Thao, University of Wisconsin-Madison Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Asian American Studies, we're going to be reflecting on the strength and profound resilience of Hmong communities and explore practical ways that we can provide more member-centered care for the communities we serve at MHS Health. As always, all programs, initiatives, and resources are open to all employees. Membership and resource utilization is wholly voluntary. Opinions and experiences within a community cannot be represented by any single source. Therefore, any perspectives expressed or information presented are shared in the spirit of reflecting and deepening our understanding through lived experiences and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the company or any group of its employees. Should you have any questions, please reach out to us at the emails listed on your screen. Additionally, as we move into today's conversation, it's important to set the stage for how we're going to engage together. This is a safe and inclusive space for reflection and conversation. The stories we hear today may touch on sensitive or deeply personal topics, such as mental health, trauma, immigration, war, and discrimination. Please take care of yourself, step away if needed, and know that there are resources available for you should you need them. The goal today is to deepen our understanding of the complex histories and unique experiences of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and understand how those experiences can shape health outcomes. I ask that we approach this conversation with respect and empathy, both when listening and when sharing. Your presence and participation matter, and by engaging in conversations like these, we strengthen our ability to approach care with humility and respect for all lived experiences. So, now that we've set the stage for today's conversation, we're going to begin our learning with BRCW and Dr. Thao. Afterwards, we'll also have time for a Q&A opportunity, so feel free to add your questions in the chat through the conversation, and we'll keep track of them. Andrew, Dr. Thao, thank you both so much for being here today. We are honored to have you. Would you like to do a quick little introduction, and then we can go ahead and get started?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lily. It's great to be back here for our second installment of our three-part series, which is focusing mainly on large resettled API groups represented here in Wisconsin. So I'm really excited to join this conversation today. My name is Andrew Lyman Trumbull. I'm the founder of Burmese Rohingya Community of Wisconsin. Been serving the Burmese community here for the past 10 years or so, and in so doing, we've met API leaders, and especially in the Hmong community, who we look to for guidance and use as a barometer of success, largely because the Hmong experience is very similar to the Burmese, and they have decades of experience for us to learn from. So really happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. I just say my name is Mai See, just call me Mai See. But yes, I'm an assistant professor of anthropology and Asian American studies. My work looks at science, medicine, and empire, but also thinking about health disparities and chronicity within refugee and immigrant populations. I work mostly with Hmong communities. I'm currently working on a book to think about chronic health within the Hmong community, and really challenging the idea that post-refugee resettlement, refugees are saved, right? But actually looking at how they continue to experience forms of precarity and vulnerability across the lifespan, and thinking about how these populations age here in the U.S. But yeah, I was also the inaugural director of Hmong Studies at UW Oshkosh, so I was able to establish the first Hmong Studies program there. I do community-based participatory research where I work with community members. I teach social science theories to community members to equip them with research skills and capacity to address pressing health concerns in their community. So I'm so thankful to be here.
Thanks so much. Andrew, are you taking over the share screen now?
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Awesome.
Okay, so our agenda today is going to be a little bit different from last time. We're just going to have two main sections where I'll introduce Hmong history and language, and then I'll let Dr. Mai See take over and do her longer presentation. So I don't want to waste any time because this is going to be packed with information. So we'll just kind of get on with it. So I want to start out by recognizing that it's a AAPI month, and every May it's always a great time because there are always so many great events around Wisconsin that celebrate the diverse group of AAPI that are here and represented. First arriving well over a century ago, and many arriving under very different circumstances. And while the theme of our series has mostly to do with resettled refugees, there are over a dozen API represented in Wisconsin, and we want to make sure that we celebrate their success and their journeys here. So the Hmong are, by some margin, the largest API group in Wisconsin. I believe Hmong is the third most commonly spoken language here. I don't know that that's true anywhere else in the country. Minnesota, it's possible. There's also a large Somali population that's about the same size as the Hmong. Anchorage, Alaska should get a shout out because they have a really large Hmong population, and in Anchorage, Hmong is the third most common spoken language there. Hmong arrived, or started arriving here in the mid-70s, and over the following several decades, the population has grown to, I believe, over 300,000 now. I just wanted to show you a couple of maps to show where the main population clusters are. This is an older map from the census. There's obviously been a census between them. And many Hmong have moved to central and southern regions as well, in Oklahoma and especially in North Carolina. So if we dial the clock back 4,500 years into ancient times in China, this is where we find the ancient roots of the Hmong people. So from what I gather, they originated between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, and there's a mythology, a story of kind of a really large battle, one of the first really large battles that was recorded, and it described a battle between the Yellow Emperor and Chi Yu, who led the Jiuli tribes, and it is my understanding that the Hmong revere Chi Yu and have ancestral ties to the tribes that made up his army. And this battle that took place, which if you look at the picture on the top, the Battle of Zuolu, had major implications, not just for the Hmong people, but for China in general. That Chi Yu lost to the Yellow Emperor, and that set into motion a sequence of events where all the tribes that were part of Chi Yu's, the Jiuli tribes, had to leave, and were forced out southward and westward. It should be noted that the Yellow Emperor was credited for the creation of the Chinese civilization, and so this battle had huge implications on the region and for the history of well, all the people in the region, frankly. If we skip forward a couple of millennia, the picture or the map in the bottom left shows imperial expansion of the Qing dynasty. And during that time, most of the Hmong people were in the southern and western parts of China. And the reason I put this map up was kind of to show the years when I guess new waves of migration and pressure from these larger empires, these larger cultures, displaced Hmong people and forced them into where we find, or where the Hmong are most populous today, which would be in southern China and in Vietnam and in Laos, in the mountainous regions there. Now, I included a picture of the Mekong River, which is terrifically important for the region and for the nations that lie within it. And I guess I want to mention a little bit about the Hmong people and I guess their experiences in Vietnam and Laos, and those that remained in China. That those that remained in China had to deal with the pressures of a larger imperial empire and the assimilation that kind of comes along with it. The Hmong that made their homes in Vietnam and Laos had to will continue to fight for their identity in being surrounded by other great powers, other big language groups, and the fact that the Hmong people were able to keep their cultural identity and their language over the course of millennia is truly impressive, because there's no shortage of foreign influences and great powers in the region and over those centuries that would make that very difficult. And if you can imagine how many cultures and languages have been lost over that period of time, it just speaks to a level of resilience that is truly impressive. So the Hmong language has its roots, as I mentioned, in China. In China, they call the Hmong languages Miao. But from what I gather, the Hmong would prefer to call it Hmong or Hmongic languages, if not just for the sense of allowing their identity to survive, which in my view is fair. And so Hmong, the Hmong language that is spoken by Hmong here, for example, is the largest language within its family group. There are dialectic differences, both between Hmong that are in Laos and Vietnam and those that are in China. But generally, as a language, it's mutually intelligible. And so someone that speaks Hmong, I think, from one region could more easily communicate with someone from another. The Hmong language, it didn't historically have a writing system, or at least it wasn't preserved in cultural archives over the centuries. Rather, cultural artifacts took the form of pottery, of significant oral traditions and pictorial textiles like pandao, which is the picture in the upper left-hand corner, which is a tapestry that's woven that tells a story. The literacy efforts for the Hmong language began in the 1950s And these were efforts by Christian missionaries, mainly from France and the United States. And some of the first language schools after resettlement were actually created here in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. So I did want to show a few maps of kind of where the Hmong are located now. Now, these maps aren't necessarily the most accurate, and you know, the areas where the Hmong live could be represented, I guess, in better ways. But generally speaking, there are large populations of Hmong in China, Vietnam, and Laos, in Thailand as well. And I included the map on the bottom left, which shows a few smaller Hmong enclaves. But I also want to show you the Karen people and where they're from, which is, I guess, it borders the Hmong people very closely. And since we are talking about in this series Burmese and Hmong folks, I just wanted to kind of show you how close some of these communities are in the region. And also like to mention that there are quite a few Hmong speakers that are near the border of Burma as well. And so this is these are people that live through multiple countries, and they could be kind of viewed like the Kurds as a nation of people without a state, without formalized borders, and that situation makes it sometimes very difficult to keep your culture alive and not be assimilated or absorbed into larger cultures that are neighbors. And so we'll move the conversation a little bit forward and talk about foreign powers and their impact in the region. It really cannot be understated that colonialization had major impacts, and boundaries have been drawn and redrawn in the areas in the region, and don't typically take into account the ethnicities that reside within. So American involvement in the region began with trade relations with China back in the late 1700s, but more importantly, it's what transpired in post-war when the United States, or when the Cold War began, and when the Communist Party took over in China. That's when the United States really ramped up its presence in the region. Before the United States arrived, Southeast Asia, the whole region, was largely colonized. Burma was part of the United Kingdom. Laos and Vietnam were part of a French colonialism, and these the vestiges of colonialism meant that the next wars that were fought were drawn on these lines. And so so the United States, you know, picked their sides, and after fighting Japanese expansion throughout the region, began to cement their I guess their agenda to counter communism, and that's where the battle lines were drawn in the French and Indo-Chinese War, and which led to the Vietnam War. So what transpired here is, to counter the northern Vietnamese, the Americans looked for allies in the region and found the Hmong people residing in Laos especially to become allies secretly to fight the war. And as the war progressed for over a decade, and eventually we lost the war. It created a terrible situation where the United States withdrew, and all the Hmong that were left behind had to contend with neighbors that not only won the war, but were very hostile towards them for their choice in who they sided with. And so that led to a refugee crisis, and many Hmong fled southward into Thailand, where refugee camps were established. And it should be mentioned, Thailand plays an important role as Siam, which was the name for Thailand before the modern borders were drawn in Southeast Asia, was never colonized, and has played a role with Burmese refugees in the same way that it played a role with Hmong refugees, as a place to go and a place where, in this case, resettlement was able to be conducted by United Nations and countries like the United States and Europe and Australia. So following the end of the Vietnam War, thousands and thousands of Hmong were resettled to the United States. And it should be mentioned that the United States involvement in the region was morally questionable. It created a situation that may very well not have happened if our involvement wasn't there. And while resettlement might certainly a right thing to do, because the lives of all the Hmong people in the region were in jeopardy. And while the United States was not able to, resettle the entire population, or perhaps would they want to, but many Hmong were resettled to the United States, so that now I think the United States is like the third or fourth largest, has the third or fourth largest Hmong population in the world. And so I'm going to go ahead and end it here and let Dr. Mai See begin her presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing and let you take it away.
Do you want me to share the slide, or I can...
I got it too. Yeah,
Okay.
I got it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Andrew, for that historical context. I think it's also important to mention that so during 1975, when Hmong people were being admitted to the U.S., we already had a very small quota for Asian resettlement in the U.S. And if you guys know the history of Asian migration to the U.S., there were a lot of constraints to Asian migration. And so when Hmong people came in 1975, it was under the Parole Act. And it wouldn't be until 1980 that they passed the Refugee Act that Hmong people were resettled in the U.S. And so this 1980s Refugee Act actually stipulated that refugees would be dispersed evenly throughout the nation so that they would not be noticeable, that the program enforced an assimilation program. And then so what ended up happening was that a lot of Hmong and Southeast Asian refugees were oftentimes resettled into poor and urban neighborhoods, and were mixed with low-income families. So here I actually have a map of redlining in Milwaukee. So I'm sure most of the people know this map in Milwaukee. And some Hmong folks were dispersed into these kinds of poor, high-risk neighborhoods where we, even today I can see the refugee resettlement process also playing out in the same way. And so upon resettlement, it wasn't easy for a lot of Hmong refugees. They faced a lot of barriers in the fact that they oftentimes didn't have English, and they were forced to get off of welfare and to take on jobs. And a lot of the labor economy didn't support non-agricultural skills, right? Or didn't support agricultural skills, which Hmong people brought to Wisconsin. And actually, if you look at some of the earlier literature on Hmong resettlement in the U.S., it was really interesting because 1980s they stipulated that there would be equal opportunities for people across gender, but what you find is that men were actually channeled into manufacturing jobs, which actually paid much more, and women were channeled more into household, like cleaning, hotels, and textile. And so that actually led to the disparity of gendered pay in the U.S. as well. So if you look at the earlier history of Hmong resettlement in the U.S., there was high levels of unemployment, poverty, dependency on federal and state assistance. Of course, and also, they're also resettling at the time of high compassion fatigue by Americans as well. So there were a lot of racial discrimination that was actually really evident, even here in Wisconsin. But that's a different lecture. Happy to talk about that another time. But Lily, why don't we go to the next slide? So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a spiel about Hmong medicine and health. So I'm a medical anthropologist, and what that means is I don't just study Hmong traditional ways of healing, right? But I also study how Hmong experiences in healthcare institutions, in doctor's visits, illuminate a larger structural problem in the U.S. because it actually helps us to think critically about some of the structural issues and barriers within our healthcare system that leads and impacts a certain kind of health experience for people overall. And what I often say is this is a way to think critically also about healthcare in America in general. So I hope you can take away from that in my work. So Lily, next slide. So on a general level, so if we look at health disparities in the Hmong community, the literature is fairly outdated. It's because we don't have enough researchers that are actually doing this research. So if you look at it, Hmong are oftentimes lumped under this Asian American category, which comprises 6% of the U.S. population. Oftentimes, when you look at the data as it is aggregated, they look healthier, they look wealthier, right? And that is what us as scholars and professors, we talk about as the model minority stereotype. Because when you actually disaggregate the data, you find that Hmong people actually have high levels of disparities and health outcomes. A study back in 2015 done by Dr. Kevin Tao, actually, he found in Wisconsin that Hmong people had a diabetes prevalence of 11.3% compared to 6.9% of non-Hispanic whites. And so if you actually look at the diabetes breakdown, racial breakdown, right? Asians, I think, have about 9% diabetes prevalence, right? And so when you look at it, when you disaggregate that at the Hmong level, you start to see that there are vast disparities. You also see higher levels of mortality from cancer, such as stomach and liver cancer, cervical cancer, as well as increased incidence of other forms of cancers. And you also have a high incidence of gout within the Hmong community, as well as kidney stones. And unfortunately, we don't know a lot of other health disparities that are impacting the community because of the little and lack of research on disaggregated data of Asian Americans. Next slide. So what does the literature say about all these differences? And so what I'd like to do when I teach Hmong American experiences at the university here, a class if you guys ever want to take, I have my students do this quick little Google search, PubMed search, Google Scholar search to kind of pull together a few abstracts together and read the abstracts of these research that addresses Hmong and health and kind of find out what are the justifications and how do researchers explain the disparities that they're seeing. And so, of course, there are themes that come across, like access to healthcare is an issue, length of time in the U.S. leads to certain kinds of chronic health, that Hmong people have mistrust of medicine, and then a lot of this literature cites Hmong cultural barriers. And this picture on the slide, on the other side, were some of the themes that we put together. And what kind of comes out of this is oftentimes a much more deficit mindset around Hmong and health, right? That most of the time Hmong people have health disparities because of the fact that they have cultural behaviors that actually lead to health disparities, or that they can't access the health care system, right? So this oftentimes put the onuses on Hmong patients without actually taking a larger structural approach to understand what are some of the barriers outside of people's own control that is actually impacting health. All right. There's a little note here about "and famine knows Hmong people," but that's, if you've ever read "The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down," that's a critique that a lot of us scholars are actually writing about, because it actually reinforces very problematic and racist stereotypes about Hmong people. But that's also a different conversation. Happy to talk about that another time. But Lily, next slide. Okay, so culture, when I see culture show up in a lot of health sciences research, I'm like, wait, okay, this is what the anthropologist studies, right? We study culture. And so how do we think critically about how the literature is representing Hmong people? I draw on the late Paul Farmer, who is a medical anthropologist and also an MD, where he talks about structural violence. And this is a quote I really appreciate from him, where he says, quote, "We are talking a lot about culture, and part of the problem lies in the way this term was used. Common indeed are ethnographies in which poverty and inequality, the end result of a long process of impoverishment, are reduced to a form of cultural difference. We were sent to the field to look for different cultures. We saw oppression. It looked well different from our comfortable lives in the university. And so we called the culture. We came, we saw, and we misdiagnosed." And so that's something that I'm trying to do as a scholar, to really push against this diagnosis of Hmong culture as a problem, to really thinking about what are the long process of impoverishment, what are the forms of vulnerabilities in the US that actually is giving way to these disparities that we saw in the earlier slide. So next slide. So just a little bit of demographics according to 2020 census, right? We can look at the Hmong population now. 71% are proficient in English, and so of course we have language issues that are going to impact health outcomes for those who are not proficient in English. 26% of Hmong age 25 and older have a bachelor's degree. And then if you look at Hmong who are immigrants 25 and older, they are less likely to have a bachelor's degree, or higher than those that are born in the US. So there's the percentage breakdown, 21% versus 31%. 14% of Hmong in the US are living in poverty, which is actually, which when you look is actually the equal share of Hmong US born, living in US born and also immigrant in poverty. And then the annual income of Hmong headed households are 85,700. And of course, this looks like they're doing very well, but this doesn't take into account multiple income contributors into the family household. It may not just be the parent contributors, could also be children that are contributing to household income. So we have to think a little bit more about that. But there's a very interesting disparity that I'm starting to see within the data, is that when you look at first generation Hmong who were immigrant, they have a higher median annual income. But then as you look at second and third generation, that household income starts to decrease over time. So that's saying something about what is life like in the US over time when we think about income and economic stability. And then in the state of Wisconsin, 38% work in manufacturing. And if my students couldn't remember this time period because they were only one, but I still remember 2008 economic crisis, where a lot of manufacturing jobs in the state of Wisconsin closed and relocated transnationally. And so to think about what does that mean for us in the state of Wisconsin and the health of our people. So next slide. So I wanted to bring together 3 research projects that I have worked on, and so 2 of them are published ones actually in progress right now. So I think some of the work that I do is in Hmong and long-term care, thinking about nursing homes and how do Hmong people experience quality of care and quality of life in nursing homes. So folks probably don't know this, but nursing homes are the most racially segregated health institution in the state, in the US. And we have a large growing aging population, but we also have an increase in Asian residents in nursing home as well. And of course, due to systemic forms of inequality, a lot of the nursing homes and where communities of color live are oftentimes lower resourced, lower staffed, and so therefore have lower quality of care. And so this comes from a research study I did with one of my colleagues up at University of Minnesota, where we looked at a nursing home that had a good proportion of Hmong residents as well as Hmong staff, and to examine what their quality of care and quality of life look like. And what we found that they oftentimes had factors that impacted quality of life and care, which oftentimes came down to language and race. And that these factors produce this kind of feeling for a lot of the residents where they just exist and they just live in this nursing home. And so I wanted to, as I'm a qualitative researcher by training, and so I wanted to provide you guys with some of the interviews that I was able to conduct. And so this is under interview, this is a Hmong resident, a Hmong male resident who can speak English, but he's talking about the residents who don't speak English, right? So he says if they don't know how to speak English, then it will be very stressful for them. There isn't one to watch over them, and that they are silent. The Hmong nurses, they are trained, but they work a lot and they don't have time. So like even though they have Hmong residents that are there in the nursing home, they're not able to be around the clock to help take care of Hmong residents. And so this Hmong male resident is noticing that there's a lot of neglect that is happening. And he goes on to say, you are Thushia, you're disappointed that elderly women who live in this country don't know how to speak English. And so if they want to drink hot water, they don't know how to ask. And if you are near, then you help to ask for them. And so residents themselves take it upon themselves to provide that kind of care because of the language difference. And then I asked the question, do they take good care of you here in this nursing home? And he says, yes, they do. But if you can't speak English, then oftentimes their care is oftentimes last minute, right? That they will take care of their people first. And when he says they take care of their people first, that's predominantly English speaking, predominantly white residents. And that also comes off in my interview with this Hmong female resident down here, where she did also share that, in this nursing home, they share a room with another resident. And she talks about how she notices that her white female roommate was oftentimes more likely to be bathed, to have their clothes changed, right? And that she herself was only bathed once a month, right? And so these were things that they talked about as were both racial, but also a language constraint. And then across the nursing home, residents always complain about the food in nursing homes, but I think a medical anthropology take on this would be like, what is the culture of the nursing home that is also giving way to some of these kinds of disparities? Is what you actually find is that the nursing home oftentimes foster a culture that is tailored towards a predominantly white resident population, but also assumes kind of a grandma and grandpa, right? And so when you look at these nursing homes that support predominantly racially minoritized residents, they're a much younger population, right? They're not just in this much higher age bracket. But the culture, the activities that they have are oftentimes crafts and arts. They have Johnny Cash music playing. They do popcorn night. And then, some of the observations that we saw when we were there was that they also did a little PowerPoint about traveling to Europe. And so a lot of these kinds of cultural practices reproduce this culture of whiteness in the nursing home. And so Hmong residents oftentimes don't see themselves a part of that. And there was only anything that was specifically Asian only came once a year, especially around the Lunar New Year, and anything that they needed pertaining to their own kinds of alternative healing therapies had to be done outside of the nursing home. And so that helps to illuminate that the nursing home and its culture really reinforces the kind of culture that doesn't make it easy for Hmong residents to thrive in. And so there is an interview that I conducted with a Hmong male nurse that I think is really heartbreaking. But he said to me that he always tells the resident's family that if they were to come to the nursing home, that the family has to continuously bring food, because sometimes the food's okay, but it's and sometimes it's not, and it's never the food that actually fits their palate, and so that then will actually deteriorate their health conditions over time. And so even these staff members are aware that the practices within the nursing home isn't sufficient to help with Hmong residents and their ability to thrive in these nursing homes. So next slide. So we also looked at not just resident interviews, but also nursing home staff interviews as well. And so that last point is kind of a good transition into thinking about then what does constitute culturally sensitive care. So when we think about racial disparities, a lot of the literature is like, okay, there's all these disparities. Why don't we just recommend more culturally sensitive care? And a lot of anthropologists actually critique this culturally sensitive care and competency movement for its potential to racially stereotype populations. But also, you can't ever be fully competent in culture, and culture is constantly changing. People are not the same. And some other anthropologists have also said that we should move from culturally competency to structural competence to think about structures like class, race, gender, how those show up. But a lot of this literature hasn't actually fully actually looked at people who are providing culturally sensitive care that is of the same racial and ethnic concordance with the residents that they're actually serving. So a lot of these culturally sensitive care literature has mostly assumed a predominantly white healthcare provider, right? And so this is the work that is also trying to intervene to think about what does culturally sensitive care look like when you are of the community? What are some of the more empirical and tangible things we can think about? And so what I found out that was actually culturally sensitive care is actually a form of labor that actually is oftentimes uncompensated for and is actually helps and benefits the nursing home very well, but leads to high forms of burnout and emotional dysregulation within nursing home residents. And so going back to that earlier point with that nursing home staff member, they're having to negotiate the culture of the nursing home itself, both in the ways in which the nursing home tends to prioritize predominantly white residents over that of other residents of color, but also to understand the limits of the medicalization of nursing home culture and having to explain like HIPAA rules and regulation, explain why if they want to use Hmong herbal healing methods, they have to use it a certain way so that it's medically compliant, right? And adheres to a lot of the regulations in the nursing home. And so these are things that we oftentimes don't think about as culturally sensitive care, but it is because they're having to negotiate and assert themselves in these kinds of spaces to address these kinds of deficiencies within nursing home. And thinking about it as labor, it's also very generative. Hmong nursing home staff members oftentimes had to educate non-Hmong staff members. They also had to activate and increase Hmong residents and their own families' understanding, and the residents' families' understanding of biomedical culture. And actually activating them to also be active agents in the healthcare system and intervening, right? And while there's high levels of personal satisfaction that comes with the job, they also face high levels of burnout. One of the guys used to work on the Southeast Asian floor, eventually ended up leaving and no longer works on the floor, but is back at the nursing home. And so they face a lot of challenges in terms of thinking about how to separate their professional and ethnic identity with a sense of obligation, as well as kind of fear of disappointment. And yeah, like none of this is compensated for. This has to be done out of their free will, out of their free time. And so how do we think about incentivizing and rewarding culturally sensitive care as a form of labor that is central to minoritized residents' health and well-being? And next slide. So moving on from my research in long-term care, I want to talk a little bit about my work in diabetes and social determinants of health. So you guys saw earlier that Hmong people experience high levels of high prevalences of diabetes. A lot of this oftentimes comes down, the literature often talks about Hmong health perceptions and uses of shamanism and traditional healing methods. But my work is to kind of move us to also thinking about social determinants. And so one of my research project that's currently a manuscript that I'm writing actually illuminates that Hmong people face ongoing forms of economic precarity, that poverty is a big contributor to whether they can control their diabetes. Younger Hmong people with type 2 diabetes are rationing their insulin, the insulin pen, right, and to check their blood sugars. And so even though we may have Hmong people who have health insurance through their employers, they have such a high deductible and the copays are so high that it's actually not reasonable for them to actually pursue that form of care, right? And so I think we need to think critically about economic stability and what does that look like in the Hmong community. And this study, we looked, most of the people that we interviewed, there was a good proportion of them that were unemployed. And so unemployment was something that they talked about that also impacted their diabetes and ability to control diabetes. And we also looked at healthcare access and quality, and similar to long-term care, some of the interviewees, they talked about how they felt that their providers oftentimes didn't trust them. And so it's interesting because a lot of the literature talks about Hmong mistrust of healthcare providers, but also it doesn't come the other way around, which I'm finding in my research study is that there's a sense of mistrust by providers and not actually enough of a kind of understanding why it is that people are having a hard time controlling diabetes. But also going back to the economic piece, we also have to think about labor occupation. A lot of the participants that we had talked about how they have jobs, but then the jobs are a 10-hour shift. They don't have time to check their blood sugar levels. They're a trucker, right? So how do we think about occupation as contributing to diabetes? And then a lot of them felt the neighborhoods that they lived in wasn't safe, even though majority owned homes. They didn't feel safe in their neighborhoods. There wasn't green space to run in. And then we have to think about social and community context. So this is actually more interesting and different in the sense where what we also found is that women who were divorced talked about that as a crucial moment and when they were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And so we need to think about the kinds of economic consequences that come from divorce, right? Because women through divorce, and I think in general, right, actually there's a decrease in income for women after divorce, right? And so we need to think about that on a larger scale, but also forms of social isolation. And currently we have a loneliness epidemic in the U.S., and you can see that Hmong people who are experiencing forms of social isolation are actually less likely to be able to control their diabetes. And I know I'm almost out of time, but Lily, let me get to my next couple slides quickly. Maybe I'll skim over this one, but if you didn't know this, Hmong people during the COVID-19 pandemic were more likely to have the highest mortality rate from COVID-19 in the state of Minnesota than any other racial group in Minnesota. And Lily, next slide. And I just want to make this quick little point. A lot of people think it's the elders that are the problem, but if you look at the vaccination rate, it's my generation, right? The ones who are 30 to 50 that are the least vaccinated. So all the Hmong elders are doing fine. So in terms of vaccination. And so I think sometimes it kind of challenges this idea that like, because they're older and they have more Hmong culture, that they're not going to be compliant. You can actually see that that's not really holding up here in this case with COVID vaccination. And then I'll end with my recommendations. So I think I want you all to kind of think about the social and societal factors that impact Hmong communities, and how do these factors like race, class, and gender give way to a very different kind of experience of health, and to think critically about the culture of medicine that you yourself are also embedded within, and how it shapes what is normal and abnormal, and thinking about how does the institution and the culture also have a hand in exacerbating health. I talked about incentivizing and supporting culturally sensitive care. It's so necessary as we have an aging immigrant population. And next slide. And I think, to address the social isolation, we should also consider a family-centered approach with diabetes. Think about occupation. There's an issue around data, so I think I would love it if, Lily and you guys also think about what does it mean to collaborate with researchers to address root causes. But I think we need to have a systems-level approach to think about employment opportunities, not just having healthcare coverage, but affordable healthcare, safe neighborhoods, as well as governmental investment in neighborhoods and the healthcare institutions and clinics, especially nursing homes. But thank you, and then I think Andrew will take it next.
Wow, thank you. That was a whirlwind tour de force. Takeaways from that. Where do I begin? What you said about nursing homes really struck a chord. I'm been dealing with that with my mother over the past several years, and hadn't really considered it. In our Burmese communities, everything's handled at home, and so there isn't even much of a consideration about being able to have care that is representative or takes into account your culture and your wishes. When you talked about delivery of medicine, that also struck a chord. And you mentioned rationing, and that mostly is kind of a zeitgeist of what's happening or what may happen with the reduction or removal of health, Medicaid and Medicare to individuals, non-green card holders, which could affect our communities. And we just did an interview with the journal Sentinel on the topic. It should come out in the next week or two, talking about how that impacts families at home and how people with medical conditions are going to be able to survive. You mentioned, the labor force and unemployment, and what I was thinking about there is that refugees have a really hardworking mentality because they come here with nothing. You have to work twice as hard. You have to save twice as much. And so there isn't much time for other stuff, including considering your own health care. Is something that I've seen over and over and over again. And so I agree that these social determinants are really, really important, especially for those that recently arrived, really especially. The social isolation aspect of it, that's something that really rings home here as well. Obviously, for people that are newly arrived that don't have a voice, because quite literally it's difficult for them to speak English or to represent themselves in forums here. It's very true, and obviously when there's a bigger issue that affects the Pan-American community, then it'll certainly reverberate down to those that struggle with it the most. So thank you so much, Mai See. That was really, really wonderful. I really appreciate it. I don't know if you have anything else to add or takeaways, but...
No, I don't think so. Thank you, Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And now I think we have some time for some questions and answers. Did anyone have any questions? Feel free to come off mute. I didn't see any come through the chat, but feel free to type anything or come off mute. I see some awesome engagement though. Excellent presentation. Oh, there is one question. It says, what questions can we ask to better determine if our members are struggling with mental health issues? Do they even, and follow-up question, do they, use the term mental health, or is it more like stress or worry or something like that?
Yeah, I think in my research, they talk a lot about stress. And, so doctors, they have a PHQ-9 form that they have patients fill out. And it's like, how often are you depressed? How often do you, think about, I don't remember, but some of the questions were like, but like, how often do you have joy or whatever. And sometimes I feel like that form isn't sufficient enough to really, ask what's going on. And for me as an anthropologist, when I'm conducting research, it's really interesting because it's actually in the clinic space that they are actually telling the providers about how stressed out they are, but the providers cannot hear it. So like in the diabetes group visits that I conducted research in, like the patients are like, I have to take my kids to school. I have these adult children I have to deal with, and then I have my husband I have to deal with, and then I can't take care of my health. And so they're already citing so much of the challenges that are impacting their health and mental health in general that then contributes to poor diabetes control. But then the provider is focused on their A1C and not the social contacts that is actually so crucial to what is actually leading up to the high levels of diabetes sugar over time. Yeah. So they're already telling you. I think it's just how do we not so much how do we ask about mental health, how do we actually hear? How do I actually hear it in these kinds of clinical space? Yeah.
I love that perspective flip too. How do we hear it? I think that's so important there too. Do we have any other questions? I think we have time for one more.
I've got a question. Dr. Tao, so when you were talking about like collaborating with researchers, do you find in your field that researchers are pretty open to collaborations like with a health insurance company or, providers or, how open are folks to doing collaborative efforts to better serve populations?
We are definitely collaborative. I think the only thing with working with a health insurance, we might have to disclaim that it's like a disclosure of research findings. But like what so Epic is the central organizer of electronic medical records. But when you try to disaggregate that data down to the Hmong level, the only way you can actually know that these are Hmong patients is by language, which actually doesn't fully capture these other disparities that I'm highlighting for you all that is actually plaguing second and third generation, right? Like I have friends my age with type 2 diabetes, with gout, right, with chronic health conditions that definitely need to be tracked and understood a little bit more. And so, yeah, I think it would be great to think about how do insurance company think about these kinds of ethnic and racial differences. Although, given the current climate, right, where sometimes these categories are oftentimes erased or omitted, like how do we do that work? And I don't think that researchers alone can do that, right? We need to have a larger collaborative approach, but also just like even engaging research with like within some of your members to kind of understand what are their needs, right, to really help that I think that will help to illuminate more of the disparities, because I think there's just not enough people on the ground doing that work, and so having a team-based approach would be really helpful.
I love that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Awesome.
And I'm sorry, like I went through a lot because these are my research, so I can also like share the manuscripts with Lily, and Lily can send them out to you guys.
Yes, we would love to, and we'll share the slides with everyone as well. Before we wrap up today, just a quick little plug. Your feedback truly matters to us. We linked a survey in the chat for you all, hoping to get your feedback about today's event. So please let us know what you think. And there's a question on there if you want to share anything with Dr. Tao or with Andrew. So please feel free to put anything in there. And thank you all so much for your time today. Thank you to our esteemed guests for all of their insightful information and sharing their lived experiences with us serving our communities. So we really appreciate everyone's time today and hope you all have a fabulous day today.
Thank you so much. Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
so much. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank